In this video, we'll cover DevSuite requirements management and best practices, specifically workflow configuration. Within DevSpec, you have a customizable workflow from which you can manage your specifications lifecycle through the process of creation through completion. In this example, in the specification here on the History tab of a spec, we can see that this item has been submitted and is in the review status. That's essentially the workflow state. And then what we want to do is to be able to move that spec into the next subsequent workflows all the way through completion. We have our workflow transition buttons that will appear above based on the transition to the next state in the workflow. For example, we have this need approval, which would move this review item to the next step in the workflow. So what I'll cover here is how to configure your admin workflow so that you have those available states and transitions to move your specifications through. In this example workflow, we can see that the initial state is review. It then can move on to approval needed or also be rejected and be moved to a dropped state. From there, it moves on to design and development and into testing and down into completed. The arrows between the states are called transitions, and then each square is a status or state that can be defined. To create a new status, a new state, it's as simple as drawing a box with your arrow, your mouse, giving it a name, and then you have the new state appear called test state. If you wanted to have that workflow transition go from review to this new test state, we would simply drag an arrow transition from one status to one state to another, give it a label called testing, for example, and then you have a transition from review to this new state called test state. And then from here, of course, you would have to link that back into whatever next state you would want from that point, and then it would rejoin the regular workflow and then be allowed to move through closure. There are some workflow options in relation to the workflow that I want to briefly cover. We have features called applicable owners, which when enabled allow you to define who on the team are allowed to own specifications in any given workflow state. We also have similar state-based set options such as read-only fields, invisible fields, mandatory fields, and an option called who can perform. Who can perform essentially allows you to define which of your team members are allowed to make changes to specifications or move specifications in that particular workflow state. So once you enable these options in the options settings, you would go into the spec workflow settings, and those options that you have enabled become tabs that are associated to each of those states and transitions. For example, if we go to the approval needed state and go to applicable owners, we can then select who is allowed to be an owner of a specification in that particular state. And this can be done based on account type, group, or group folder, or individual users. If you were to select based on account type, for example, executive manager, that would mean anybody that was an executive manager account type would fall under that category and be allowed to be an applicable owner in that state. If it was a group, it would be all the members of that particular group. If it was a group folder, that would be an actual folder or queue or virtual owner that would be allowed to own that spec in that state. There are some settings that are based on transitions because it's more of an action, such as the who can perform option. So in a similar way to the applicable owners, you select that action item or that transition action, called approved or reject, and that you would in a similar way then select who the applicable or who the users are who can perform those actions in that state. Also, the invisible field and read-only field settings are also possible from each state. So you would then choose your state and then choose which fields on that particular page are then going to be read-only or which fields you want to be an invisible field based on that workflow state.